He Rode to Makkah. By Muhammad Asad. 4. Voices, Section 1-3. 1. We ride, and Zaid sings. The dunes are lower now and wider spaced. Here and there the sand gives way to stretches of gravel and splintery basalt, and in front of us, far to the south, rise the shadowy outlines of hill ranges, the mountains of Jabal Shamar. The verses of Zaid's song penetrate in a blurred way into my sleepiness, but precisely in the measure that the words escape me, they seem to gain a wider, deeper significance quite unrelated to their outward meaning. It is one of those camel rider songs you so often hear in Arabia, chants which men sing to keep their animals to a regular, quick pace and not to fall asleep themselves, chants of desert men accustomed to spaces that know neither limits nor echoes, always sounded in the major key at only one tone. Level, loose and somewhat husky, coming from high up in the throat, tenderly fading in the dry air, breath of the desert caught in a human voice. None who has traveled through desert lands will ever forget this voice. It is always the same where the earth is barren, the air hot and wide open, and life hard. We ride, and Zaid sings, as his father must have sung before him, and all the other men of his tribe and of many other tribes over thousands of years, for thousands of years were needed to mold these intensive, monotonous melodies and to bring them to their final form. Unlike the polyphonous Western music, which almost always tends to express individual feeling, these Arabian melodies, with their eternally repeated tone sequence, seem to be only tonal symbols for an emotional knowledge shared by many people, not meant to evoke moods but to remind you of your own spiritual experiences. They were born very long ago out of the atmosphere of the desert, the rhythms of the wind and of nomad life, the feel of wide expanses, the contemplation of an eternal present, and just as the basic things of human life always remain the same, these melodies are timeless and changeless. Such melodies are hardly thinkable in the West, where polyphony is an aspect not only of music but of man's feelings and desires. Cool climate, running waters, the sequence of 4 seasons, these elements give to life so multiform a significance and so many directions that Western man must needs have many longings and, thus, a strong urge to do things for the sake of doing. He must always create, build, and overcome in order to see himself again and again reaffirmed in the complexity of his life forms, and this ever-changing complexity is reflected in his music as well. Out of the sonorous Western singing, with the voice coming from the chest and always playing in several levels, speaks that Faustian nature which causes Western man to dream much, to desire much, to strive after much with a will to conquer, but perhaps also to miss much, and miss it painfully. 4. The world of the Westerner is a world of history, eternal becoming, happening, passing away. It lacks the restfulness of staying still. Time is an enemy, always to be viewed with suspicion, and never does the now carry a sound of eternity. To the Arab of the desert and steppe, on the other hand, his landscape is no enticement to dreams, it is hard like the day and knows no twilight of feelings. The outer and the inner, the I and the world, are to him not opposite, and mutually opposed, entities, but only different aspects of an unchanging present. His life is not dominated by secret fears, and whenever he does things, he does them because outward necessity and not a desire for inner security demands action. In result, he has not progressed in material achievement as rapidly as the Westerner, but he has kept his soul together. For how long, I ask myself with almost a physical start, will Zaid, and Zaid's people, be able to keep their souls together in the face of the danger that is so insidiously, so relentlessly closing in on them? We are living in a time in which the East can no longer remain passive in the face of the advancing West. 1,000 forces, political, social and economic, are hammering at the doors of the Muslim world. Will this world succumb to the pressure of the Western 20th century and in the process lose not only its own traditional forms but its spiritual roots as well? 2. Throughout the years I have spent in the Middle East, as a sympathetic outsider from 1922 to 1926, and as a Muslim sharing the aims and hopes of the Islamic community ever since, I have witnessed the steady European encroachment on Muslim cultural life and political independence. And wherever Muslim peoples try to defend themselves against this encroachment, European public opinion invariably labels their resistance, with an air of hurt innocence, as xenophobia. Europe has long been accustomed to simplify in this crude way all that is happening in the Middle East and to view its current history under the aspect of Western spheres of interest alone. While everywhere in the West, outside of Britain, public opinion has shown much sympathy for the Irish struggle for independence, or, outside of Russia and Germany, for Poland's dream of national resurrection, no such sympathy is ever extended to similar aspirations among the Muslims. The West's main argument is always the political disruption and economic backwardness of the Middle East. And every active Western intervention is sanctimoniously described by its authors as aiming not merely at a protection of legitimate Western interests but also at securing progress for the indigenous peoples themselves. Forgetting that every direct, and even benevolent, intervention from outside cannot but disturb a nation's development. Western students of Middle Eastern affairs have always been ready to swallow such claims. They see only the new railroads built by colonial powers, and not the destruction of a country's social fabric. They count the kilowatts of new electricity, but not the blows to a nation's pride. The same people who would never have accepted Imperial Austria's civilizing mission as a valid excuse for her interventions in the Balkans indulgently accept a similar plea in the case of the British in Egypt, the Russians in Central Asia, the French in Morocco, or the Italians in Libya. And it never even crosses their minds that many of the social and economic ills from which the Middle East is suffering are a direct outcome of that very Western interest. And that, in addition, Western intervention invariably seeks to perpetuate and to widen the already existing inner disruptions and so to make it impossible for the peoples concerned to come into their own. I first began to realize this in Palestine. In 1922. When I observed the equivocal role of the British administration with regard to the conflict between the Arabs and the Zionists. And it became fully obvious to me early in 1923, when after months of wandering all over Palestine I came to Egypt, which at that time was in almost continual upheaval against the British protectorate. Bombs were often being thrown at public places frequented by British soldiers, to be answered by various repressive measures, martial law, political arrests, deportations of leaders, prohibitions of newspapers. But none of these measures, however severe, could deaden the people's desire for freedom. Through the entire Egyptian nation went something like a wave of passionate sobbing. Not in despair, it was rather the sobbing of enthusiasm at having discovered the roots of its own potential strength. Only the rich pashas, owners of the tremendous landed estates, were in those days conciliatory toward British rule. The innumerable others, including the miserable fellahin, to whom 1 acre of land appeared to be a bountiful possession for an entire family, supported the freedom movement. One day the itinerant newspaper vendors would cry in the streets, "All leaders of the Wafd arrested by order of the military governor," but the next day new leaders had taken their places, the gaps were filled again and again, the hunger for freedom and the hatred grew. And Europe had only one word for it: xenophobia. My coming to Egypt in those days had been due to my wish to extend the scope of my work for the Frankfurter Zeitung to other countries besides Palestine. Dorian's circumstances did not permit him to finance such a tour, but when he saw how strongly I desired it, he advanced me a small sum sufficient for the railway journey from Jerusalem to Cairo and a fortnight's stay there. In Cairo I found lodgings in a narrow alley in a quarter inhabited mainly by Arab artisans and small Greek shopkeepers. The landlady was an old Triestine, tall, thick-set, cumbrous, grey. She drank from morning till evening heavy Greek wine and floundered from one mood into another. Hers was a violent, passionate temperament that never seemed to have found itself, but she was friendly toward me and made me feel well in her presence. After a week or so, my cash was approaching its end. As I did not want to return so soon to Palestine and the safety of my uncle's house, I began to look around for some other means of subsistence. My Jerusalem friend, Dr. Dahan, had given me a letter of introduction to a businessman in Cairo, and to him I went in search of advice. He proved to be a large, genial Hollander with intellectual interests far exceeding his own sphere of activities. From Jacob Dahan's letter he learned that I was a correspondent of the Frankfurter Zeitung, and when, at his request, I showed him some of my recent articles, he raised his eyebrows in astonishment. "Tell me, how old are you?" 22. "Then tell me something else, please. Who has helped you with these articles, Dahan?" I laughed. "Of course not. I wrote them myself. I always do my work myself. But why do you doubt it?" He shook his head, as if puzzled, "But it's astonishing. Where did you get the maturity to write such stuff? How do you manage to convey in a half-sentence an almost mystical significance to things that are apparently so commonplace?" I was flattered beyond words at the implied compliment, and my self-esteem rose accordingly. In the course of our conversation, it transpired that my newfound acquaintance had no opening in his own business, but he thought he might be able to place me in an Egyptian firm with which he had dealings. The office to which he directed me lay in one of the older quarters of Cairo, not far from my lodgings, a dingy, narrow lane bordered by once patrician houses now converted into offices and cheap apartments. My prospective employer, an elderly, bald-headed Egyptian with the face of a time-mellowed vulture, happened to be in need of a part-time clerk to take charge of his French correspondence, and I was able to satisfy him that I could fill the role in spite of my utter lack of business experience. We quickly struck a bargain. I would have to work only 3 hours a day, the salary was correspondingly low, but it would be enough to pay for my rent and to keep me indefinitely in bread, milk, and olives. Between my lodgings and my office lay Cairo's red light district, a tangled maze of lanes in which the great and little courtesans spent their days and nights. In the afternoon, on my way to work, the lanes were empty and silent. In the shadow of a bay window a woman's body would stretch itself languorously. At little tables before one or another of the houses girls were sedately drinking coffee in the company of grave, bearded men and conversing, with every appearance of seriousness, about things that seemed to lie far beyond all excitement and physical abandon. But in the evening, when I was returning home, the quarter was more wide awake than any other. Humming with the tender accords of Arabian lutes and drums and the laughter of women. When you walked under the shine of the many electric lamps and colored lanterns, at every step a soft arm would wind itself around your neck. The arm might be brown or white, but it always jingled with gold and silver chains and bangles and always smelled of musk, frankincense and warm animal skin. You had to be very determined to keep yourself free of all these laughing embraces and from the calls of Ya Habibi, oh darling, and Sa'adatak, thy happiness. You had to thread your way between shimmering limbs that were mostly luscious and fair to look upon and intoxicated you with their suggestive convolutions. All Egypt broke over you, Morocco, Algeria, also the Sudan and Nubia, also Arabia, Armenia, Syria, Iran. Men in long silken garments sat side by side on benches along the house walls, pleasantly excited, laughing, calling out to girls or silently smoking their narghiles. Not all of them were customers, many had come simply to spend a pleasant hour or two in the exhilarating, unconventional atmosphere of the quarter. Sometimes you had to step back before a ragged dervish from the Sudan, who sang his begging songs with an entranced face and stiffly outstretched arms. Clouds of incense from the swinging censer of an itinerant perfume vendor brushed your face. Off and on you heard singing in chorus, and you began to understand the meaning of some of the whirring, tender Arabic sounds. And again you heard the soft, rippling voices of pleasure, the animal pleasure of these girls. For they undoubtedly were enjoying themselves. In their light blue, yellow, red, green, white, gold glittering garments of flimsy silk, tulle, voile, or damask, and their laughter seemed to run with little cat steps over the cobbled pavement, rising, ebbing down, and then growing up again from other lips. How they could laugh, these Egyptians! How cheerfully they walked day in, day out over the streets of Cairo, striding with swinging steps in their long, shirt-like galabiyas that were striped in every color of the rainbow, light-heartedly, free-mindedly, so that one might have thought that all the grinding poverty and dissatisfaction and political turmoil were taken seriously only in a relative sense. The violent, explosive excitement of these people always seemed to be ready to make room, without any visible transition, for perfect serenity and even indolence, as if nothing had ever happened and nothing were amiss. Because of this, most Europeans regarded, and probably do even now, the Arabs as superficial, but even in those early days I realized that this contempt for the Arabs had grown out of the West's tendency to overestimate emotions that appear to be deep, and to denounce as superficial everything that is light, airy, unweighted. The Arabs, I felt, had remained free of those inner tensions and stresses so peculiar to the West. How could we, then, apply our own standards to them? If they seemed to be superficial, it was perhaps because their emotions flowed without friction into their behavior. Perhaps, under the impact of Westernization, they also would gradually lose the blessed immediacy of their contact with reality. For although that Western influence acted in many ways as a stimulus and fertilizing agent on contemporary Arab thought, it inevitably tended to produce in the Arabs the same grievous problems that dominated the spiritual and social scene in the West. Opposite my house, so close that you could almost touch it, stood a little mosque with a tiny minaret from which 5 times a day the call to prayer was sounded. A white-turbaned man would appear on the gallery, raise his hands, and begin to chant, Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest. And I bear witness that Muhammad is God's messenger. As he slowly turned toward the 4 points of the compass, the ring of his voice climbed upward, grew into the clear air, rocking on the deep, throaty sounds of the Arabic language, swaying, advancing and retreating. The voice was a dark baritone, soft and strong, capable of a great range, but you could perceive that it was fervor and not art that made it so beautiful. This chant of the Muezzin was the theme song of my days and evenings in Cairo, just as it had been the theme song in the old city of Jerusalem and was destined to remain in all my later wanderings through Muslim lands. It sounded the same everywhere in spite of the differences of dialect and intonation which might be evident in the people's daily speech. A unity of sound which made me realize in those days at Cairo how deep was the inner unity of all Muslims, and how artificial and insignificant were the dividing lines between them. They were one in their way of thinking and judging between right and wrong, and one in their perception of what constitutes the good life. It seemed to me that for the first time I had come across a community in which kinship between man and man was not due to accidents of common racial or economic interests but to something far deeper and far more stable. A kinship of common outlook which lifted all barriers of loneliness between man and man. In the summer of 1923, enriched by a better understanding of Middle Eastern life and politics, I returned to Jerusalem. Through my good friend Jacob Dahan I became acquainted with Amir Abdullah of neighboring Transjordan, who invited me to visit his country. There I saw for the first time a true Bedouin land. The capital, Amman, built on the ruins of Philadelphia, the Greek colony of Ptolemaeus Philadelphus, was at that time a little town of hardly more than 6,000 inhabitants. Its streets were filled with Bedouins, the real Bedouins of the open steppe whom one rarely saw in Palestine, free warriors and camel breeders. Wonderful horses galloped through the streets, every man was armed, carried a dagger in his sash and a rifle on his back. Circassian ox carts. For the town had been originally settled by Circassians who had migrated there after the Russian conquest of their homeland in the 19th century, plodded heavily through the bazaar, which in spite of its smallness was full of a bustle and commotion worthy of a much larger city. As there were no adequate buildings in the town, Amir Abdullah lived in those days in a tent camp on a hill overlooking Amman. His own tent was somewhat larger than the others and consisted of several rooms formed by canvas partitions and distinguished by utmost simplicity. In one of them, a black bearskin made a bed on the ground in a comber. In the reception room, a couple of beautiful camel saddles with silver inlaid pommels served as armrests when one sat on the carpet. Except for a Negro servant richly dressed in brocade, with a golden dagger in his belt, there was nobody in the tent when I entered it in the company of Dr. Riza Tawfiq Bey, the Emir's chief advisor. He was a Turk, formerly a university professor, and had been for 3 years, before Kemal Ataturk, Minister of Education in the Turkish cabinet. Amir Abdullah, he told me, would be back in a few minutes. Just now he was conferring with some Bedouin chieftains about the latest Najdi raid into southern Transjordan. Those Najdi Wahhabis, Dr. Riza explained to me, played within Islam a role not unlike that of the Puritan reformers in the Christian world. Inasmuch as they were bitterly opposed to all saint worship and the many mystical superstitions that had crept into Islam over the centuries, they were also irreconcilable enemies of the Sharifian family, whose head was the Emir's father, King Hussain of the Hijaz. According to Riza Tawfiq Bey, the religious views of the Wahhabis could not be rejected out of hand. They did, in fact, come closer to the spirit of the Quran than the views prevalent among the masses in most of the other Muslim countries, and might thus in time exert a beneficial influence on the cultural development of Islam. The extreme fanaticism of these people, however, made it somewhat difficult for other Muslims to appreciate the Wahhabi movement fully, and this drawback, he suggested, might not be unwelcome to certain quarters, to whom a possible reunification of the Arab peoples was a dreadful prospect. A little later the Amir came in, a man of about 40 years, of middle size, with a short, blonde beard, stepping softly on small, black patent leather slippers, clad in loose Arab garments of swishing white silk with an almost transparent white woolen abaya over them. He said, "Alan wa salan, family and plain," and that was the first time I heard this graceful Arabian greeting. There was something attractive and almost captivating in the personality of Amir Abdullah, a strong sense of humor, a warmth of expression and a ready wit. It was not difficult to see why he was so popular in those days with his people. Although many Arabs were not happy about the role he had played in the British-inspired Sharifian revolt against the Turks and regarded it as a betrayal of Muslims by Muslims. He had gained a certain prestige by his championship of the Arab cause against Zionism, and the day was yet to come when the twists and turns of his politics would make his name odious throughout the Arab world. Sipping coffee from minute cups that were handed round by the blade retainer, we talked, occasionally assisted by Dr. Riza, who spoke fluent French, of the administrative difficulties in this new country of Transjordan, where everyone was accustomed to carry arms and to obey only the laws of his own clan. But, said the Amir, the Arabs have plenty of common sense. Even the Bedouins are now beginning to realize that they must abandon their old lawless ways if they want to be free from foreign domination. The intertribal feuds of which thou must have heard so often are now gradually subsiding. And he went on describing the unruly, uneasy Bedouin tribes which used to fight with one another on the slightest pretext. Their blood feuds often lasted for generations and sometimes, handed down from father to son, even for centuries, leading to ever new bloodshed and new bitterness after the original cause had almost been forgotten. There was only one way to bring about a peaceful end. If a young man from the tribe and clan of the last victim abducted a virgin of the tribe and clan of the culprit and made her his wife, the blood of the bridal night, blood of the killer's tribe, symbolically, and finally, avenged the blood that had been spilled in homicide. Occasionally it happened that two tribes had grown weary of a vendetta which had been going on for generations, sapping the strength of both parties, and in such a case, an abduction was not infrequently arranged through a middleman from a third tribe. I have done even better than that, Amir Abdullah told me. I have established proper blood feud commissions composed of trustworthy men who travel around the country and arrange the symbolic kidnappings and marriages between hostile tribes. But, and here his eyes twinkled, I always impress upon the members of these commissions to be very careful in the choice of the virgins, for I would not like to see internal family feuds arise on the grounds of the bridegroom's possible disappointment. A boy of perhaps 12 years appeared from behind a partition, swept across the dusky tent room with quick, noiseless steps and jumped without stirrup onto the prancing horse outside the tent which a servant had been holding in readiness for him, the Emir's eldest son, Talal. In his slim body, in his rapid vault onto the horse, in his shining eyes I saw it again, that dreamless contact with his own life which set the Arab so far apart from all that I had known in Europe. Observing my obvious admiration of his son, the Amir said, he, like every other Arab child, is growing up with but one thought in mind, freedom. We Arabs do not believe ourselves to be faultless or free from error, but we want to commit our errors ourselves and so learn how to avoid them, just as a tree learns how to grow right by growing, or as running water finds its proper course by flowing. We do not want to be guided to wisdom by people who have no wisdom themselves, who have only power and guns and money, and only know how to lose friends whom they could so easily keep as friends. I did not intend to remain indefinitely in Palestine, and it was again Jacob Dahan who helped me. Himself a journalist of established reputation. He had many connections all over Europe. His recommendation secured for me contracts with two small newspapers, one in Holland and the other in Switzerland, for a series of articles to be paid in Dutch guilders and Swiss francs. As these were provincial newspapers of no great standing, they could not afford to pay a large remuneration, but to me, whose habits were simple, the money I received from them appeared ample to finance my planned journey through the Near East. At that time, 1923, nobody could have foreseen the bitter antagonism which in later years would mar the relations between Amir Abdullah and his son Talal, the son hating his father's complaisance with regard to British policies in the Arab world, and the father resenting his son's passionate outspokenness. Nor could I see on that or on later occasions any sign of the mental disturbance in Talal that led to his enforced abdication from the throne of Jordan in 1952. I wanted to go to Syria first, but the French authorities, so recently established there in the midst of a hostile population, were unwilling to give a visa to an Austrian ex-enemy alien. This was a bitter blow, but there was nothing I could do about it, and so, I decided to go to Haifa and there to board a ship for Istanbul, which in any case was included in my program. On the train journey from Jerusalem to Haifa a calamity befell me. I lost a coat containing my wallet and passport. All that I had left were the few silver coins in my trousers pocket. A voyage to Istanbul was, for the time being, out of the question. No passport, no money. Nothing remained but to return by bus to Jerusalem. The fare would have to be paid on arrival with money borrowed, as usual, from Dorian. In Jerusalem I would have to wait for weeks for another passport from the Austrian consulate in Cairo, for at that time there was none in Palestine, and for further driblets of money from Holland and Switzerland. And so it came about that on the next morning I found myself before a bus office on the outskirts of Haifa. The negotiations about the fare were completed. There was 1 hour until the departure of the bus, and to while away the time I paced up and down the road, deeply disgusted with myself and with the fate that had forced me into so ignominious a retreat. Waiting is always an evil thing, and the thought of returning to Jerusalem defeated, with my tail between my legs, was most galling, the more so as Dorian had always been skeptical about my ability to realize my plans on the basis of such meager funds. Moreover, I would not see Syria now, and God alone knew if I would ever come back to this part of the world. It was, of course, always possible that at some later date the Frankfurter Zeitung would finance another journey to the Middle East, and that one day the French might lift the embargo on ex-enemy aliens, but that was not certain, and in the meantime I would not see Damascus. Why, I asked myself bitterly, was Damascus denied to me? But, was it really? Of course, no passport, no money. But was it absolutely necessary to have a passport and money? And, having come so far in my thoughts, I suddenly stopped in my tracks. One could, if one had grit enough, travel on foot, availing oneself of the hospitality of Arab villagers, and one could, perhaps, somehow smuggle oneself across the frontier without bothering about passports and visas. And before I was quite aware of it, my mind was made up, I was going to Damascus. A couple of minutes sufficed to explain to the bus people that I had changed my mind and was not going to Jerusalem after all. It took me a few more to change into a pair of blue overalls and an Arab kufi. The best possible protection against the Arabian sun, to stuff a few necessities into a knapsack, and to arrange for my suitcase to be dispatched to Dorian, COD. And then I set out on my long trek to Damascus. The overwhelming sense of freedom that filled me was indistinguishable from happiness. I had only a few coins in my pocket, I was embarking on an illegal deed that might land me in prison, the problem of crossing the frontier lay ahead in a vague uncertainty, I was staking everything on my wits alone, but the consciousness of having placed all on a single stake made me happy. I walked on the road to Galilee. In the afternoon the plain of Esdraelon lay on the right below me, flecked with rags of light and shadow. I passed through Nazareth and before nightfall reached an Arab village shaded by pepper trees and cypresses. At the door of the first house sat 3 or 4 men and women. I stopped, asked whether this was Arena, and after a yes was about to move on, when one of the women called after me. Yasadai, wilt thou not refresh thyself? And, as if divining my thirst, stretched a pitcher of cold water toward me. When I had drunk my fill, one of the men, obviously her husband, asked me, wilt thou not eat bread with us, and remain in our house overnight? They did not ask me who I was, where I was going or what my business was. And I stayed overnight as their guest. To be a guest of an Arab, even school children hear about it in Europe. To be a guest of an Arab means to enter for a few hours, for a time, truly and fully, into the lives of people who want to be your brothers and sisters. It is not a mere noble tradition which enables the Arabs to be hospitable in so effusive a way, it is their inner freedom. They are so free of distrust of themselves that they can easily open their lives to another man. They need none of the specious security of the walls which in the West each person builds between himself and his neighbor. We supped together, men and women, sitting cross-legged on a mat around a huge dish filled with a porridge of coarsely crushed wheat and milk. My hosts tore small pieces from large, paper-thin loaves of bread with which they deftly scooped up the porridge without ever touching it with their fingers. To me they had given a spoon, but I refused it and attempted, not without success, and to the evident pleasure of my friends, to emulate their simple and nevertheless dainty manner of eating. When we lay down to sleep, about a dozen people in one and the same room, I gazed at the wooden beams above me from which strings of dried peppers and eggplant were hanging. At the many niches in the walls filled with brass and stoneware utensils, at the bodies of sleeping men and women, and asked myself whether at home I could ever have felt more at home. In the days that followed, the rust brown of the Judean hills with their bluish gray and violet shadows gradually gave way to the more gay and mellow hills of Galilee. Springs and little streams unexpectedly made their appearance. Vegetation became more luxuriant. In groups stood thickly leafed olive trees and tall, dark cypresses. The last summer flowers could still be seen on the hillsides. Sometimes I walked part of the way with camel drivers and enjoyed for a while their simple warmth. We drank water from my canteen, smoked a cigarette together, then I walked on alone. I spent the nights in Arab houses and ate their bread with them. I tramped for days through the hot depression along the Lake of Galilee and through the soft coolness around Lake Huel, which was like a mirror of metal, with silvery mists, slightly reddened by the last rays of the evening sun that hovered over the water. Near the shore lived Arab fishermen in huts built of straw mats loosely slung around a framework of branches. They were very poor, but they did not seem to need more than these airy huts, the few faded garments on their backs, a handful of wheat to make bread and the fish they caught themselves, and always they seemed to have enough to ask the wanderer to step in and eat with them. The northernmost point in Palestine was the Jewish colony of Metala, which, I had learned earlier, was a kind of gap between British-administered Palestine and French Syria. On the basis of an agreement between the two governments, this and two neighboring colonies were shortly to be incorporated into Palestine. During those few weeks of transition, Metala was not effectively supervised by either of the two governments, and thus appeared to be an ideal place from which to slip into Syria. It was, I understood, only later, on the highways, that identification papers would be demanded of the traveler. The Syrian control was said to be very strict. It was practically impossible to go far without being stopped by gendarmes. As Metala was officially still considered part of Syria, every one of its adult inhabitants held, like elsewhere in the country, an identity certificate issued by the French authorities. To secure such a paper for myself became my most pressing task. I made some discreet inquiries and was finally guided to the house of a man who might be prepared to part with his certificate for a consideration. He was a large person in his late 30s and was described as such in the crumpled and greasy document which he pulled out of his breast pocket, but as the paper bore no photograph, the problem was not insoluble. "How much do you want for it?" I asked. £3. I took from my pocket all the coins I possessed and counted them. They came to 55 piastres, that is, a little over half a pound. "This is all I have," I said, "as I must keep something for the rest of my journey. I can give you no more than 20 piastres, which was exactly 1/15 of what he had demanded. After some minutes of haggling we settled on 35 piastres, and the document was mine. It consisted of a printed sheet with 2 columns, one French and the other Arabic, the relevant data having been inserted in ink on the dotted lines. The personal description did not bother me much, for, as is usual with such descriptions, it was wonderfully vague. But the age mentioned was 39, while I was 23 and looked 20. Even a very careless police officer would immediately notice the discrepancy, and so it became necessary to change the age entry. Now if it had been mentioned in one place only, the change would not have been so difficult, but unfortunately it was given in French as well as in Arabic. Despite my careful penning, I achieved what could only be described as an unconvincing forgery. To anybody with eyes in his head it would be obvious that the figures had been altered in both columns. But that could not be helped. I would have to rely on my luck and the negligence of the gendarmes. Early in the morning my business friend led me to a gully behind the village, pointed to some rocks about half a mile beyond, and said, "There is Syria." I made my way across the gully. Although the hour was early, it was very hot. It must also have been hot to the old Arab woman who sat under a tree near the rocks beyond which was Syria, for she called out to me in a husky, brittle voice, "Wouldst thou give a drink of water to an old woman, son?" I unslung my freshly filled canteen and gave it to her. She drank avidly and then handed it back to me, saying, "May God bless thee, may he keep thee secure and lead thee to thy heart's goal." "Thanks, mother, I do not want more than that." And when I turned around and looked back at her, I saw the old woman's lips move as if in prayer and felt a strange elation. I reached the rocks and passed them, and now I was in Syria. A wide, barren plain lay before me. Far away on the horizon I saw the outlines of trees and something that looked like houses. It must be the town of Baniyas. I did not like the look of this plain that offered no tree or bush behind which to take cover, which, so near the frontier, might well become necessary. But there was no other way. I felt as one sometimes feels in a dream in which one has to walk naked down a crowded street. It was nearly noon when I reached a small streamlet bisecting the plain. As I sat down to take off my shoes and socks, I saw in the distance 4 horsemen moving in my direction. With their rifles held across the saddle, they looked ominously like gendarmes. They were gendarmes. There would have been no sense in my trying to run away, and so I comforted myself that whatever was to happen would happen. If I were caught now, I would probably receive no more than a few blows with a rifle butt and be escorted back to Midala. I waded through the stream, sat down on the opposite bank and started leisurely to dry my feet, waiting for the gendarmes to come closer. They came and stared down at me with suspicion, for although I was wearing Arab headdress, I was obviously a European. "From where?" one of them asked me sharply in Arabic. "From Midala." "And where to?" "To Damascus." "What for?" "Oh, well, just a pleasure trip." "Any papers?" "Of course." And out came my identity certificate and up came my heart to my mouth. The gendarme unfolded the paper and looked at it, and my heart slipped back to its proper place and started to beat again, for I saw that he held the document upside down, obviously unable to read. The 2 or 3 big government seals apparently satisfied him, for he ponderously folded and handed it back to me. "Yes, it is in order. Go." For a second, I had the impulse to shake his hand, but then thought it better to let our relations remain strictly official. The 4 men wheeled their horses around and trotted away, while I continued on my march. Near Baniyas I lost my way. What had been described on my map as a road fit for wheeled traffic proved to be a hardly visible path which meandered over steppe land, swampy ground, and across little streams, and in the end petered out entirely near some boulder-strewn hillocks. I wandered over these hills for several hours, up and down, until, in the afternoon, I came upon two Arabs with donkeys that were carrying grapes and cheese to Baniyas. We walked the last stretch together, they gave me grapes to eat, and we separated on reaching the gardens before the town. A clear, narrow, rapidly flowing stream was bubbling by the roadside. I lay down on my belly, thrust my head up to the ears in the icy water and drank and drank. Although I was very tired, I had no intention of staying at Baniyas, which, being the first town on the Syrian side, was bound to have a police post. My encounter with the gendarmes had set me at rest as regards ordinary Syrian troopers, for most of them could be presumed to be illiterate and therefore not in a position to detect my forgery, but a police post, with an officer in it, would be a different story. I therefore set out at a quick pace through narrow lanes and byways, avoiding the main bazaar street where such a post would most likely be located. In one of the lanes, I heard the sound of a lute and a man's voice singing to the accompaniment of clapping. Drawn to it, I rounded the corner, and stood quite still, for just opposite me, at a distance of perhaps 10 paces, was a door inscribed Pace de Police, with several Syrian policemen, an officer among them, sitting on stools in the afternoon sun and enjoying the music of one of their comrades. It was too late to retreat, for they had already seen me, and the officer, apparently also a Syrian, called out to me. "Hey, come here." There was nothing to it but to obey. I advanced slowly, and then a brainwave struck me. Taking out my camera, I politely greeted the officer in French and continued, without waiting for his questions. "I am coming from Metala on a short visit to this town but would not like to go back without taking a photo of you and your friend here, whose song has so enchanted me." Arabs like to be flattered, and in addition they delight in being photographed, and so the officer consented with a smile and requested me to send him the photograph after it was developed and printed, which I later did, with my compliments. It no longer occurred to him to ask me for my identification papers. Instead, he treated me to a cup of sweet tea and wished me bon voyage when I finally rose to go back to Metala. I retreated the way I had come, made a circuit around the town, and proceeded on my way to Damascus. Exactly 2 weeks after I had left Haifa I arrived at the big village, almost a town, of Mahdal ash-Shams, which was inhabited mainly by Druzes and a few Christians. I chose a house which looked fairly prosperous and told the young man who opened the door to my knock that I would be grateful for shelter for the night. With the usual Ahlan wa Sahlan the door was opened wide, and within a few minutes I found myself accepted into the small household. As I was now deep in Syria, with several possible ways leading to Damascus, I decided to take my Druze host into my confidence and ask his advice. Knowing that no Arab would ever betray his guest, I placed all the facts squarely before him, including the fact that I was traveling on a false identity certificate. I was told that it would be extremely risky for me to travel on the highway because from here onward it was patrolled by French gendarmes, who would not let me pass as easily as the Syrians had done. "I think I will send my son with thee," said my host, pointing toward the young man who had opened the door to me, "and he will guide thee across the mountains and help thee to avoid the roads." After the evening meal we sat down on the open terrace before the house and discussed the route we should take next morning. On my knees was spread the small-scale German map of Palestine and Syria which I had brought with me from Jerusalem. And I was trying to follow on it the course indicated by my Druze friend. While we were thus occupied, a man in the uniform of a police officer, evidently a Syrian, came strolling along the village street. He had appeared so suddenly from around a corner that I had hardly time enough to fold the map, let alone hide it from his view. The officer seemed to recognize a stranger in me, for after passing our terrace with a nod to my host, he turned back at the next comber, and slowly walked toward us. "Who are you?" he asked in French in a not unkind voice. I repeated my usual rigmarole about being a colonist from Metala on a pleasure trip, and when he demanded to see my identity certificate, I had to give it to him. He looked at the paper attentively, and his lips twisted in a grin. "And what is it that you have in your hand?" he continued, pointing to the folded German map. I said that it was nothing of importance, but he insisted on seeing it, unfolded it with the deft fingers of a man accustomed to handling maps, looked at it for a few seconds, folded it carefully and handed it back to me with a smile. Then he said in broken German, "During the war I served in the Turkish army side by side with the Germans." And he saluted in the military fashion, grinned once again and walked away. He has understood that thou art an Alemanni. He likes them, and hates the French. He won't bother thee. Next morning, accompanied by the young Druze, I set out on what must have been the hardest march of my life. We walked for over 11 hours, with only one break at noon for about 20 minutes, over rocky hills, down deep gorges, through dry river beds, up hills again, between boulders, over sharp pebbles, uphill, downhill, uphill, downhill, until I felt that I could walk no more. When in the afternoon we reached the town of Al-Qatana in the plains of Damascus, I was entirely worn out, my shoes were torn, and my feet swollen. I wanted to stop overnight at the place, but my young friend advised strongly against it. There were too many French police around, and as it was a town and not a village, I would not so easily find shelter without attracting attention. The only alternative was to secure a ride in one of the automobiles that plied for hire between here and Damascus. I had still my 20 piasters. During the entire journey from Haifa I had had no need to spend a single penny, and 20 piasters happened to be the fare for a car ride to Damascus. In the ramshackle office of the transport contractor, in the main square of the town, I was informed that I would have to wait for about half an hour until the next car left. I parted from my friendly guide, who embraced me like a brother, and set out immediately on the first stage of his way home. Sitting with my knapsack by my side near the door of the booking office, I dozed off under the rays of the late afternoon sun, only to be rudely awakened by someone shaking me by the shoulder, a Syrian gendarme. The usual questions came, followed by the usual answers. But the man was apparently not quite satisfied and told me, "Come with me to the police station and talk there to the officer in charge." I was so tired that it no longer mattered to me whether I was discovered or not. The officer in the station room proved to be a big, burly French sergeant, his tunic unbuttoned, behind a desk on which stood an almost empty bottle of arak and a dirty glass. He was completely, angrily, drunk and glared with bloodshot eyes at the policeman who had brought me in. "What is it now?" The policeman explained in Arabic that he had seen me, a stranger, sitting in the main square, and I explained in French that I was not a stranger, but a law-abiding citizen. "Law-abiding citizen?" the sergeant shouted. "You people are scamps, vagabonds who walk up and down the country only to annoy us. Where are your papers?" As I was fumbling with stiff fingers for the identity certificate in my pocket, he banged his fist on the table, and bellowed, "Never mind, get out of here." And as I was closing the door behind me I saw him reach for his glass and bottle. After the long march, what a relief, what an ease to ride, no, almost glide in a car from A1 Katana over the broad highway into the orchard-covered plain of Damascus. On the horizon lay my goal, an endless sea of treetops, with a few shining domes and minarets faintly visible against the sky. Far away, somewhat to the right, stood a solitary naked hill, its crest still lighted by the sun, while soft shadows were already creeping up its base. Above the hill, a single cloud, narrow, long, glittering dusk, steep, distant pale blue sky, over the plain, a dove grey golden against the mountains to our right and to our left, a light air. Then, tall fruit gardens enclosed by mud walls, riders, carts, carriages, soldiers, French soldiers. The dusk became green like water. An officer roared by on a motorcycle, with his huge goggles resembling a deep-sea fish. Then, the first house. Then, Damascus, a surf of noise after the silence of the open plain. The first lights were leaping up in windows and streets. I felt a gladness such as I could not remember. But my gladness came to an abrupt end as the car stopped beyond the poste de police on the outskirts of the city. "What is the matter?" I asked the driver by my side. "Oh, nothing. All cars coming from outside must report to the police on arrival." A Syrian policeman emerged from the station and asked, "From where are you coming?" "Only from Al-Qatana," replied the driver. "Oh, well, in that case go on," for this was obviously only local traffic. The driver let in his clutch with a grind. We moved on and I breathed freely once more. But at that moment someone called out from the street, "The top is loose." And a few paces beyond the poste de police the driver stopped the aged car to attend to the open top that had flopped down on one side. While he was thus engaged, the policeman approached us idly once again, apparently interested in no more than the driver's mechanical problem. Then, however, his glance alighted on me and I saw, with a stiffening of my whole body, that his eyes became alert. He was looking me up and down, came closer, and squinted at the floor of the car where my knapsack lay. "Who art thou?" he asked suspiciously. I began, "From Metala," but the policeman was shaking his head unbelievingly. Then he whispered something to the driver. I could make out the words. "English soldier. Deserter." And for the first time it dawned upon me that my blue overalls, my brown kufiyah with its gold-threaded eagle and my military-type knapsack, which I had bought in a junk shop in Jerusalem, closely resembled the outfit of the Irish constabulary employed in those days by the government of Palestine, and I also remembered that there was an agreement between the French and British authorities to extradite their respective deserters. In my broken Arabic I tried to explain to the policeman that I was no deserter, but he waved aside my explanations. Explain all this to the inspector. And so I was obliged to go into the police station, while the driver, with a muttered apology for not being able to wait for me, started the car and disappeared from view. The inspector was out for the time being but, I was told, would be back any moment. I had to wait in a room which contained only a bench and, apart from the main entry, 2 other doors. Over one of them was inscribed Gardien de Prison and over the other simply Prison. Amid these very unpropitious surroundings I waited for over half an hour, each minute more and more convinced that this was my journey's end, for inspector sounded much more ominous than simply officer. If I were now discovered, I would have to spend some time, perhaps weeks, in jail as under trial prisoner. Then I would receive the customary sentence of 3 months, after serving it I would have to march on foot, accompanied by a mounted gendarme, back to the frontier of Palestine, and, to top it all, I might expect an eviction from Palestine as well for breaking passport regulations. The gloom in the waiting room was nothing compared with the gloom within me. Suddenly I heard the whir of a motor car. It stopped before the station gate. A moment later a man in civilian dress with a red tarbush on his head entered the room with a quick step, followed by the policeman who was excitedly trying to report something to him. The inspector was quite obviously in a great hurry. I do not know exactly how it happened, but I presume that what I did at that crucial moment was the outcome of one of those rare flashes of genius which in different circumstances, and perhaps in different men, produce events that change history. With a single bound, I came close to the inspector and, without waiting for his questions, hurled at him a torrent of complaints in French against the insulting clumsiness of the policeman who had taken me, an innocent citizen, for a deserter and caused me to lose my ride into the city. The inspector tried several times to interrupt me, but I never gave him a chance and engulfed him in a flow of words of which, I suppose, he was hardly able to gather 1/10, probably only the names Metla and Damascus, which I repeated an endless number of times. He was evidently distressed at being kept away from something he had to do in a hurry, but I did not let him speak and continued, without stopping for breath, with my wordy barrage. Ultimately, he threw up his hands in despair and cried, "Stop, for God's sake! Have you any papers?" My hand went automatically into my breast pocket and, still pouring out sentence after sentence in an unceasing stream, I thrust the false identity certificate into his hands. The poor man must have felt as if he were drowning, for he only quickly turned over a corner of the folded sheet, saw the government stamp, and threw it back at me. All right, go, only go." And I did not wait for him to repeat his request. A few months earlier, in Jerusalem, I had met a Damascene teacher who had invited me to be his guest whenever I came to Damascus, and it was after his house that I now inquired. A little boy offered himself as my guide and took me by the hand. Deep evening. The old city. Narrow lanes which the overhanging oriel windows made more nightly than the night itself could make them. Here and there I could see, in the yellow light of a kerosene lantern, a fritteer's shop with a mound of watermelons and baskets of grapes outside it. People like shadows. Sometimes behind the latticed windows a woman's shrill voice. And then the little boy said, "Here." I knocked at a door. Somebody answered from inside and I lifted the latch and entered a paved courtyard. In the darkness I could discern grapefruit trees heavy with green fruit and a stone basin with a fountain. Someone called out from above, "Tafadal, ya Sidi," and I ascended a narrow staircase along one of the outer walls and walked through an open loggia and into the arms of my friend. I was dead tired, entirely exhausted, and let myself fall unresistingly onto the bed that was offered me. The wind rustled in the trees of the courtyard in front and in the trees of the garden behind the house. From the distance came many muffled sounds, the voice of a great Arabian city going to sleep. It was with the excitement of a new understanding, with my eyes open to things I had not suspected before, that I wandered in those summer days through the alleys of the old bazaar of Damascus and recognized the spiritual restfulness in the life of its people. Their inner security could be observed in the way they behaved toward one another, in the warm dignity with which they met or parted, in the manner in which two men would walk together, holding each other by the hand like children, simply because they felt friendly toward each other, in the manner in which the shopkeepers dealt with one another, those traders in the little shops, those inexorable callers to passers-by, seemed to have no grasping fear and no envy in them, so much so that the owner of a shop would leave it in the custody of his neighbor and competitor whenever it became necessary for him to be away for a while. I often saw a potential customer stop before an untended stall, obviously debating within himself whether to wait for the return of the vendor or to move on to the adjoining stall, and invariably the neighboring trader, the competitor, would step in to inquire after the customer's wants and sell him the required goods, not his own goods, but those of his absent neighbor, and would leave the purchase price on the neighbor's bench. Where in Europe could one have witnessed a like transaction? Some of the bazaar streets were thronged with the hardy figures of Bedouins in their wide, flowing garments, men who always seemed to carry their lives with themselves, and always walked in their own tracks. Tall men with grave, burning eyes were standing and sitting in groups before the shops. They did not talk much to one another, one word, one short sentence, attentively spoken and as attentively received, sufficed for long conversations. These Bedouins, I felt, did not know chatter, that talking about nothing, with nothing at stake, the hallmark of worn-out souls, and I was reminded of the words of the Quran which described life in paradise. And thou hearest no chatter there. Silence seemed to be a Bedouin virtue. They wrapped themselves in their wide, brown and white, or black cloaks and kept silent. They passed you by with a silent child's glance, proud, modest and sensible. When you addressed them in their tongue, their black eyes lit up in a sudden smile, for they were not self-absorbed and liked to be sensed by the stranger. They were grand seigneurs, entirely reserved and nevertheless open to all things of life. On a Friday, the Muslim Sabbath, you could perceive a change of rhythm in the life of Damascus, a little whirlwind of happy excitement and, at the same time, solemnity. I thought of our Sundays in Europe, of the silent city streets and closed shops. I remembered all those empty days and the oppression which that emptiness brought forth. Why should it be so? Now I began to understand it. Because to most people in the West their everyday life is a heavy load from which only Sundays can release them. Sunday is no longer a day of rest but has become an escape into the unreal, a deceptive forgetfulness behind which, doubly heavy and threatening, the weekday lurks. To the Arabs, on the other hand, Friday did not seem to be an opportunity to forget their workdays. Not that the fruits of life fell easily and without effort into the laps of these people, but simply because their labors, even the heaviest, did not seem to conflict with their personal desires. Routine, for the sake of routine, was absent. Instead, there was an inner contact between a working man and his work, and so respite became necessary only if one got tired. Such a consonance between man and his work must have been envisaged by Islam as the natural state of affairs and, therefore, no obligatory rest had been prescribed for Friday. The artisans and small shopkeepers in the Damascus bazaars worked for a few hours, abandoned their shops for a few hours, during which they went away to the mosque for their noon prayers and afterward met with some friends in a cafe. Then they would come back to their shops and work again for a few hours in glad relaxation, everyone just as he pleased. Only a few shops were closed, and except during the time of prayer, when the people assembled in the mosques, all the streets were as full of bustle as on other days. One Friday I went with my friend and host into the Umayyad Mosque. The many marble columns which supported the domed ceiling shone under the sun rays that fell through the lintel windows. There was a scent of musk in the air, red and blue carpets covered the floor. In long, even rows stood many hundreds of men behind the imam who led the prayer. They bowed, knelt, touched the ground with their foreheads, and rose again, all in disciplined unison, like soldiers. It was very quiet. While the congregation was standing, one could hear the voice of the old imam from the distant depths of the huge hall, reciting verses from the Quran, and when he bowed or prostrated himself, the entire congregation followed him as one man, bowing and prostrating themselves before God as if he were present before their eyes. It was at this moment that I became aware how near their God and their faith were to these people. Their prayer did not seem to be divorced from their working day, it was part of it, not meant to help them forget life, but to remember it better by remembering God. How strange and wonderful, I said to my friend as we were leaving the mosque, that you people feel God to be so close to you. I wish I could feel so myself. How else could it be, oh my brother? Is not God, as our holy book says, nearer to thee than the vein in thy neck. Spurred by my new awareness, I spent much of my time at Damascus reading all manner of books on Islam on which I could lay my hands. My Arabic, although sufficient for the purposes of conversation, was as yet too weak for reading the Quran in the original, and so I had to take recourse to two translations, one French and the other German, which I borrowed from a library. For the rest, I had to rely on European Orientalist works and on my friends' explanations. However fragmentary, these studies and talks were like the lifting of a curtain. I began to discern a world of ideas of which hitherto I had been entirely ignorant. Islam did not seem to be so much a religion in the popular sense of the word as, rather, a way of life, not so much a system of theology as a program of personal and social behavior based on the consciousness of God. Nowhere in the Quran could I find any reference to a need for salvation. No original, inherited sin stood between the individual and his destiny, for, nothing shall be attributed to man but what he himself has striven for. No asceticism was required to open a hidden gate to purity, for purity was man's birthright, and sin meant no more than a lapse from the innate, positive qualities with which God was said to have endowed every human being. There was no trace of any dualism in the consideration of man's nature. Body and soul seemed to be taken as one integral whole. At first, I was somewhat startled by the Quran's concern not only with matters spiritual but also with many seemingly trivial, mundane aspects of life. But in time I began to understand that if man were indeed an integral unity of body and soul, as Islam insisted he was, no aspect of his life could be too trivial to come within the purview of religion. With all this, the Quran never let its followers forget that the life of this world was only one stage of man's way to a higher existence, and that his ultimate goal was of a spiritual nature. Material prosperity, it said, is desirable but not an end in itself, and therefore man's appetites, though justified in themselves, must be restrained and controlled by moral consciousness. This consciousness ought to relate not merely to man's relation with God but also to his relations with men. Not only to the spiritual perfection of the individual but also to the creation of such social conditions as might be conducive to the spiritual development of all, so that all might live in fullness. All this was intellectually and ethically far more respectable than anything I had previously heard or read about Islam. Its approach to the problems of the spirit seemed to be deeper than that of the Old Testament and had, moreover, none of the latter's predilection for one particular nation, and its approach to the problems of the flesh was, unlike the New Testament, strongly affirmative. Spirit and flesh stood, each in its own right, as the twin aspects of man's God-created life. Was not perhaps this teaching, I asked myself, responsible for the emotional security I had so long sensed in the Arabs? One evening my host invited me to accompany him to a party in the house of a rich Damascene friend who was celebrating the birth of a son. We walked through the winding lanes of the inner city, which were so narrow that the projecting bay windows and lattice-encased balconies almost touched one another from opposite sides of the street. Deep shadows and peaceful silence dozed between the old houses of stone. Sometimes a few black-veiled women passed you by with swift little steps, or a bearded man, dressed in a long kaftan, appeared from around a corner and slowly disappeared behind another. Always the same corners and irregular angles, always the same narrow lanes which cut across one another in all directions, always promising to lead to astounding revelations and always opening into another, similar lane. But the revelation did come in the end. My friend and guide stopped before a nondescript wooden door set in a blank, mud-plastered wall and said, "Here we are," knocking with his fist against the door. It opened with a squeak. A very old man bade us welcome with a toothlessly mumbled, "Ahlan, Ahlan wa sahlan," and through a short corridor with 2 right-angled turns we entered the courtyard of the house that from outside had resembled nothing so much as a mud-colored barn. The courtyard was wide and airy, paved like a huge chessboard with white and black marble slabs. In a low, octagonal basin in the center a fountain was playing and splashing. Lemon trees and oleander bushes, set in small openings in the marble pavement, spread their blossom and fruit-laden branches all over the courtyard and along the inner house walls, which were covered from base to roof with alabaster reliefs of the most delicate workmanship, displaying intricate, geometrical patterns and leafy arabesques, interrupted only by windows framed in broad, lace-like open work of marble. On one side of the yard the walls were recessed to form, about 3 feet above ground level, a deep niche the size of a large room, accessible by broad marble steps. Along the 3 walled sides of this niche, called liwan, ran low, brocade divans, while on the floor a costly carpet was spread. The niche walls were lined with huge mirrors up to a height of perhaps 15 feet, and the entire courtyard with its trees, its black and white pavement, its alabaster reliefs, marble window embrasures and carved doors which led to the interior of the house, and the many-colored throng of guests who sat on the divans and strolled around the water basin, all this was duplicated in the mirrors of the liwan. And when you looked into them, you discovered that the opposite wall of the courtyard was covered with similar mirrors in its entire width, so that the whole spectacle was being reflected twice, 4 times, 100 times, and thus transformed into a magic, endless ribbon of marble, alabaster, fountains, myriads of people, forests of lemon trees, oleander groves, an endless dreamland glistening under an evening sky still rosy from the rays of the setting sun. Such a house, bare and unadorned on the street side, rich and delightful within, was altogether new to me. But in time I came to know that it was typical of the traditional dwellings of the well-to-do not only in Syria and Iraq but also in Iran. Neither the Arabs nor the Persians cared in earlier days for facades. A house was meant to be lived in and its function was limited to its interior. This was something quite different from the forced functionalism so much sought after in modern Western architecture. The Westerners, entangled in a kind of inverted romanticism, unsure of their own feelings, nowadays build problems. The Arabs and Persians build, or built until yesterday, houses. The host seated me to his right on the divan, and a barefooted servant offered coffee on a small brass tray. Smoke from bubbling nargils mingled with the rose-water-scented air of the liwan and floated in wisps toward the glass-shaded candles which were being lighted, one after another, along the walls and between the darkening green of the trees. The company, all men, was most varied. Men in kaftans of striped, rustling Damascus silk or ivory-colored Chinese raw silk, voluminous jubbas of pastel-shaded fine wool, gold-embroidered white turbans, over red tarbushes, men in European clothes, but obviously completely at ease in their cross-legged position on the divans. Some Bedouin chieftains from the steppes, with their retinues, were there, eyes black and gloriously alive, and small black beards around lean, brown faces. Their new clothes swished with every movement, and all of them carried silver-sheathed swords. They were indolently and completely at ease, true aristocrats, only that their ease, in distinction from that of European aristocrats, was not a soft shine bred through generations of loving care and good living, but like a warm fire coining out of the sureness of their perceptions. A good air surrounded them, a dry and clear atmosphere, the same air which I had once sensed in reality on the borders of the desert, embracing in its chastity but not intruding. They were like distant friends, like passing visitors in this place. Their free, aimless life awaited them elsewhere. A dancing girl came out of one of the doors and ran lightly up the steps to the liwan. She was very young, certainly no more than 20, and very beautiful. Dressed in billowing trousers of some crackling, iridescent silk material. A pair of golden slippers and a pearl-embroidered bodice which not so much covered as accentuated her high, upstanding breasts. She moved with the sensuous grace of one accustomed to be admired and desired, and you could almost hear the ripple of delight that ran through this assembly of men at the sight of her soft-limbed body and her taut ivory skin. She danced, to the accompaniment of a hand drum wielded by the middle-aged man who had entered the liwin immediately behind her, one of those traditional, lascivious dances so beloved in the East, dances meant to evoke slumbering desires and to give promise of a breathless fulfillment. "O thou wonderful, O thou strange," murmured my host. Then he slapped my knee lightly and said, "Is she not like soothing balm on a wound?" As quickly as she had come, the dancer disappeared, and nothing remained of her but the hazy shimmer in the eyes of most of the men. Her place on the carpet in the liwin was taken by 4 musicians, some of the best in all Syria, I was told by one of the guests. One of them held a long-necked lute, another a flat, single-headed drum, like a timbrel without jingles, the third an instrument that resembled a zither, and the fourth an Egyptian tambour, something like a very wide brass bottle with a bottom of drum skin. They began to twang and drum delicately, playfully at first, without any discernible accord, seemingly each man for himself, as if tuning their instruments in preparation for a common upward beat. He with the zither drew his fingertips lightly several times over the strings from high to low with a subdued, harp-like effect. The tambour player drummed softly, stopped, and drummed again. The man with the lute struck, as if absent-mindedly, a few low, sharp chords in quick succession. Chords that seemed only by accident to coincide with the dry, monotonously repeated beat of the timbrel and to draw the tambour into a hesitant response to the strumming of the strings, now of the lute, now of the zither, and before you became quite aware of it, a common rhythm had bound the 4 instruments together and a melody took shape. A melody? I could not say. It rather seemed to me that I was not so much listening to a musical performance as witnessing an exciting happening. Out of the chirping tones of the string instruments there grew up a new rhythm, rising in a tense spiral and then, suddenly, falling down, like the rhythmic rising and falling of a metallic object. Faster and slower, softer and stronger. In dispassionate persistence, in endless variations, this one uninterrupted happening, this acoustic phenomenon which trembled in a restrained intoxication, grew up, spread out powerfully, went to the head, and when it suddenly broke off in the midst of a crescendo, how early, much too early. I knew, I was imprisoned. The tension of this music had imperceptibly enwrapped me. I had been drawn into these tones which in their apparent monotony recalled the eternal recurrence of all things existing and knocked at the doors of your own feelings and called forth, step by step, all that had been moving in you without your knowledge. Laid bare something that had always been there and now became obvious to you with a vividness that made your heart pound. I had been accustomed to Western music, in which the entire emotional background of the composer is drawn into each individual composition, reflecting in every one of its moods all the other, possible moods, but this Arabian music seemed to flow from a single level of consciousness, from a single tension that was nothing but tension and could therefore assume personal modes of feeling in every listener. After a few seconds of silence the tambour rumbled again, and the other instruments followed. A softer sway, a more feminine rhythm than before. The individual voices adjusted themselves more closely to each other, warmly enfolded one another, and, as if bound together in a spell, became more and more excited. They stroked each other, flowed around each other in soft, wavy lines which at first collided several times with the roll of the tambour as if with a hard obstacle, but gradually grew in aggressiveness, overcame the tambour and enslaved it, dragging it along in a common spiral ascent. And the tambour, unwilling at first, soon fell prey to the common rapture and joined, intoxicated, the others. The wavy line lost its feminine softness and raced on with rising violence. Quicker, higher, shriller, into a cold furioso of conscious passion that had given up all restraint and now became a dithyrambic climb to some unseen peaks of power and sovereignty. Out of the erstwhile circling flow of tones around each other emerged a tremendous rotation in unison, a rushing of wheels out of eternity into eternity. Without measure or limit or goal, a breathless, reckless tightrope walkers run over knife-edge precipices, through one eternal present, toward an awareness that was freedom and power and beyond all thought. And, suddenly, in the midst of an upsurging sweep, a stop and a deadly silence. Brutal. Honest. Clean. Like a rustling of tree leaves, breath returned to the listeners, and the long-drawn murmur for Ya Allah went through them. They were like wise children who play their long understood and ever-tempting games. They were smiling in happiness. 3. We ride and Zaid sings always the same rhythm, always the same monotonous melody. For the soul of the Arab is monotonous but not in sense of poverty of imagination. He has plenty of that, but his instinct does not go, like that of Western man after width, three-dimensional space, and the simultaneity of many shades of emotion through Arabian music speaks a desire to carry, each time, a single emotional experience to the utmost end of its reach. To this pure monotony, this almost sensual desire to see feeling intensified in a continuous, ascending line, the Arabian character owes its strength and its faults. Its faults, for the world wants to be experienced, emotionally, in space as well. And its strength, for the faith in the possibility of plan endless linear ascent of emotional knowledge can in the sphere of the mind lead nowhere but to God. Only on the basis of this inborn drive, so peculiar to people of the desert, could grow the monotheism of the early Hebrews and its triumphant fulfillment, the faith of Muhammad. Behind both stood the motherly desert.